Mind your own business, old man. I'm not going to say it again. Officer Bryce Holloway's voice cracked across the mall corridor, like a whip sharp enough to silence the holiday music drifting down from the ceiling speakers. His open hand came back in a wide, deliberate arc and struck Walter Briggs across the face, the sound of it echoing off the tile floor and the high glass atrium above. The mall went still. Walt's head turned with the impact. He didn't stumble. He didn't reach for his cheek. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, while Holloway rolled his shoulder back with the lazy satisfaction of a man who had just confirmed something he already believed about the world. What Officer Bryce Holloway did not know was that he had just put his hands on a man who had spent 31 years deciding calmly and without hesitation exactly how a confrontation like this would end. Before we continue, drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story is one you do not want to miss. The mall had been loud all afternoon, in the particular way malls get loud in December. Christmas music looped through hidden speakers, competing with the clatter of shopping carts and the high, excited voices of children who had not yet learned to lower them. The smell of cinnamon drifted from a candle kiosk near the food court, tangled up with fried dough and pretzel salt, and somebody's too strong perfume. Walter Briggs moved through all of it slowly, the way a man moves when he has learned over a long life, full of places where he could not afford to move slowly, to be grateful for the privilege of taking his time. He was 67 years old, silver at the temples, a quilted gray jacket zipped to the collar, dark slacks pressed with a precision that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with habit. His late wife Dorothy used to tease him that he dressed like he was perpetually expecting an inspection. He never fully stopped. 3 years after her funeral, he still ironed his own shirts on Sunday nights, still polished his shoes before church, still set 2 coffee cups out by reflex some mornings before catching himself. He stopped at a jewelry kiosk just inside the mall's east wing and looked down through the glass case at a small display of charm bracelets. There were 2 that had caught his eye. One was silver with a single star charm, delicate and simple. The other had a row of small enamel hearts in different colors, brighter, louder. The kind of thing an 11-year-old girl might love for exactly 6 months before deciding it was babyish. The heart said Otis Green appearing at his elbow with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own opinion. Maya'll love the hearts. Walt didn't look up. I didn't ask you. You've been standing here for 5 minutes, Walter. A man doesn't stand in front of a jewelry case for 5 minutes unless he needs help. Otis Green was 70 years old, a retired high school football coach with 38 years of service to a single school district and the unshakable conviction that he had an informed opinion about absolutely everything from bracelets to the proper way to season collared greens. He had been Walt's closest friend for almost 2 decades, which meant Walt had spent 2 decades listening to those opinions with a patience that occasionally surprised even him. The star, Walt said finally. She's 11, not 7. The star's for a baby. The hearts say, happy birthday. I see you. I know what you like. The star says her grandfather thinks she's going to grow into something simple and good, Walt said. Not everything has to shout Otis. He turned the little silver star over once in his fingers before setting it back on the velvet display pad, and for a moment, the mall noise around him fell away into something quieter, more private. Dorothy would have known immediately which one to choose. She always did. She had a way of looking at a gift, the way she looked at people past the surface of it, toward the version of the person who would actually receive it, not the version a salesperson imagined. Walt had been making these decisions alone for 3 years now, ever since the cancer had taken her, in 11 quiet, terrible weeks, that he still sometimes measured his life by the way some men measured their lives, by wars or by children born. He still talked to her sometimes in the garden, mostly where the talking felt less like grief and more like company. He had asked her opinion on this bracelet 2 days ago out loud alone in his kitchen, and had felt slightly foolish about it afterward, though not foolish enough to stop doing it. Maya's 12th birthday was in 9 days. She was sharp in the particular way that skipped a generation, sometimes asking questions that made grown adults pause before answering, and Walt found himself wanting more than almost anything else in his life. Now she aimed to get small things right for her. The big things, the things he had once been responsible for in places whose names he had never said out loud to anyone in this family, those were finished, filed away. What remained was this: a star, or a row of hearts, and the quiet, stubborn hope that he could still choose correctly for the people he loved. The young woman behind the counter, her name tag reading. Priya smiled and reached for the star bracelet. "Want this gift wrapped, sir? Please." While she worked, Otis leaned against the counter and continued the argument with the persistence of a man who had once kept a losing football team motivated through an entire winless season. "You should get the hearts, too. Backup gift. In case she hates the star." "She won't hate the star. You don't know that." "I know my granddaughter. You see her 4 times a year, Walter." "I know my granddaughter," Walt repeated, and there was something underneath the words, not annoyance, just a quiet certainty that made Otis finally let it go, muttering something about stubborn old men under his breath as Priya finished wrapping the small box in silver paper. Behind them, the mall continued its December churn. Walt watched its reflection in the glass display case without appearing to watch anything at all. A security guard crossing the far end of the atrium with his hands clasped behind his back, 2 teenagers weaving through the crowd at twice the speed everyone else was moving, a mother trying to corral 3 children near a Santa display, a man arguing quietly into his phone outside a shoe store. His eyes moved across all of it, the way water moves across a floor, finding every edge, cataloging without effort the way they had moved across rooms for longer than he liked to remember. He had done it so long that he no longer noticed he was doing it. It was simply how he occupied a space, any space, without ever quite being present in it the way other people were. There was a particular discipline to the way his attention worked, something that had been trained into him decades ago and had never fully switched off, no matter how many years had passed since it mattered in the way it once had. He registered exits without meaning to the main entrance, behind him, the service corridor, past the food court, the emergency exit by the restrooms with its faintly glowing green sign. He registered faces the way other people registered weather, a passive awareness running beneath whatever else he was doing, noting who lingered too long, who moved with purpose and who moved without it, who was watching the crowd and who was simply part of it. He could not have explained this to Otis even if he'd wanted to. It would have sounded paranoid, or worse, sad, an old man still running surveillance on a shopping mall full of strangers buying Christmas presents. But it wasn't paranoia. It was simply the residue of 31 years spent in places where the difference between noticing and not noticing had occasionally been the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. The habit had outlived its usefulness years ago. He had never managed to put it down anyway. "You want it gift-wrapped too, or you want to throw it in a bag and call it a day?" Priya asked, holding up the small wrapped box with a faint smile, clearly amused by the back and forth she'd just witnessed. "This is perfect," Walt said. "Thank you." He tucked the small box into his coat pocket rather than carry a bag. And the 2 men began walking toward the food court, Otis already talking about where they should eat, debating the relative merits of the Chinese place versus the barbecue stand with the same intensity he'd brought to the bracelet argument. Walt listened with perhaps half his attention. The other half did what it had always done in crowded, unfamiliar spaces, what had kept him alive in places he had never discussed with anyone in this mall, in this town, in this entire chapter of his life. He watched. The voice reached him before the words did, not loud, exactly raised, but controlled, carrying the particular edge of someone who wanted to be heard by everyone nearby. Not because he was afraid, but because he wanted them to understand who was in charge. Walt slowed. 20 yards ahead, just outside a clothing store, with a red clearance sign taped in the window. A man in a Caldwell Police Department uniform had a young black woman by the upper arm. She looked to be in her early 20s, still dressed in pale blue nursing scrubs, the kind that meant she'd come straight from a long shift. She was holding a small paper receipt out toward the officer, with her free-hand arm fully extended, the particular gesture of someone holding proof out to a person who has already decided not to look at it. The officer was broad through the shoulders, younger than he carried himself, standing with his feet planted wide and his chin tilted up in the universal posture of a man who had learned that volume could substitute for evidence. His name tag read Holloway. Beside him stood a second officer, younger Latina, her posture noticeably more uncertain. her eyes moving between her partner and the young woman with a discomfort she wasn't bothering to hide. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," Holloway was saying. "I am calm," the young woman answered. Her voice was steady, but pulled tight, the careful evenness of someone working very hard to keep it that way. "I have my receipt. I bought the scarf. It's right here." "That's what you're telling me." "That's what the receipt says. Receipts get faked all the time." She stared at him. "It's a $14 scarf." Holloway's mouth curved slightly, the particular smile of a man who found the whole exchange mildly entertaining. A small crowd had begun to gather in the loose, careful way mall crowds always do, close enough to see far enough to pretend they weren't watching. Nobody moved closer. Nobody said anything. A woman pushing a stroller slowed, glanced at the scene, and then very deliberately turned and walked the opposite direction. The younger officer, her name tag read, Castillo, leaned slightly toward her partner and said something too quiet for the crowd to hear, though Walt caught the shape of it from 20 feet away. "Bryce. She has a receipt." Holloway didn't look at her. "I've got this, Renee." The crowd kept growing in the way these things grow, almost against the will of the people in it. A man in a delivery uniform, stopping mid-stride, two older women pausing their conversation. Three teenagers drifting closer with their phones, already half raised but not yet recording, as though uncertain whether this was the kind of moment that deserved to be remembered or the kind better forgotten by everyone involved. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word in the young woman's defense. There was a particular quality to the silence, not indifference exactly, but a kind of practiced self-preservation. The instinct that told each individual person in that loose semicircle that involvement carried a cost and that the safest place to stand was just outside the boundary of consequence. Walt had seen this exact silence in a dozen countries on 3 continents, the universal physics of a crowd-watching power exercise itself against someone with none. It never stopped being its own kind of violence, the watching. He understood it. He had on certain days, in certain decades, been part of it himself, when the mission required invisibility above all else. He had never stopped hating it. Otis's hand found Walt's sleeve and gripped it. "Don't," he said quietly, the single word carrying the full weight of 2 decades of friendship, and every time he had watched Walt do exactly the thing he was about to do now. "Walter, don't." Walt watched the young woman's face. He watched her hold the receipt steady, even though her hand was beginning to shake at the edges. He watched her measure every word before she said it, the careful arithmetic of a person who understood the way every black woman in this country eventually learns to understand that losing composure now would become the story that her fear, if she let it show, would be read as guilt, and her anger, if she let it show, would be read as danger, and that there was no version of this moment where she got to simply be right and have it matter. She was doing everything correctly. It wasn't working. "Don't," Otis said again, lower this time. Walt reached into his coat pocket and pressed the small wrapped box into Otis's free hand without looking at him. Then he set his shopping bag down on the floor beside a bench, and he started walking forward at the same unhurried pace he had been walking all afternoon. No urgency in his stride, no tension visible in his shoulders, nothing in his bearing to suggest that anything unusual was about to happen at all. He stopped roughly 6 feet from Officer Holloway and the young woman in nursing scrubs, close enough to be heard far enough to not be mistaken for a threat by anyone watching who didn't already understand what stillness like his actually meant. "Excuse me," he said, calm, clear, unhurried. Officer Holloway turned. His eyes moved over Walt, the way some men's eyes move over anyone they've already decided. "Doesn't matter," quick, dismissive, complete in under a second. Older man, quilted jacket, gray at the temples. Not a threat. Not worth the time. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," Holloway said. "Keep moving." "My name is Walter Briggs," Walt said, his voice level and factual. The voice of a man delivering a report rather than starting an argument. "I was standing at the jewelry counter when this young woman went into that store, and I was standing there when she came back out. I watched the entire transaction. She didn't behave suspiciously. She made a purchase and she left. I'm telling you what I saw." Holloway's gaze flattened. "Good for you. Now keep moving. There's no probable cause here for you to be involved in." "There doesn't appear to be probable cause for her to be involved either." Walt said, given that she has a receipt. Something shifted across Holloway's face, the mild amusement hardening into something else, something closer to insult, as though Walt's calm itself were a kind of disrespect. He took a step closer, close enough that Walt could smell coffee and aftershave. "I'm going to say this one more time, old man," Holloway said, his voice dropping into something quieter and far more dangerous than the volume he'd been using on the crowd. "Mind your own business." Behind Walt, Otis said low and urgent, "Walter, come on. Let it go." The young woman's eyes found Walt's for just a second. In them was something that wasn't quite hope. It was too tired to be hope, but the exhausted recognition of someone who had stopped expecting anyone to step forward and didn't know what to do now that someone had. Walt didn't move. He looked at Holloway, didn't blink, didn't shift his weight, didn't look away. He simply stood the way certain men stand when they have walked into rooms far more dangerous than a suburban shopping mall and decided every single time exactly how the room was going to end. "She's free to go," Walt said quietly. The crowd around them went very still. Holloway's jaw tightened. He looked at Walt the way certain men look at anyone who refuses to shrink in front of them, as though the refusal itself were a personal insult, as though dignity in someone he had already decided didn't deserve it was the single most aggravating thing in the world. He leaned in slightly close enough now that his next word landed soft and deliberate, meant only for Walt, but pitched to be overheard by everyone within 10 feet. "Boy," he said, "back up." The word landed exactly the way he meant it to land, loud enough, old enough. A test disguised as a command designed to remind everyone watching exactly which one of them was supposed to be afraid. Walt didn't move, not an inch. There was a particular kind of calculation that happened in moments like this one, that Walt had performed so many times across so many years, that it no longer felt like thinking at all. It felt more like breathing automatic and complete before he was even fully aware he had done it. He registered Holloway's stance, the slight forward lean, the weight distributed wrong for a man who genuinely expected resistance rather than simply expecting compliance. He registered the second officer's posture, already half a step back, already uncomfortable, a woman who hadn't yet decided what she was watching, but understood enough to not want to be standing this close to it when it happened. He registered the crowd's silence, the particular quality of an audience that has decided collectively, and without ever discussing it among themselves, that this was someone else's problem, to solve someone else's risk to take. He registered Holloway's eyes, not afraid, not even especially angry, just certain, the absolute and total certainty of a man who had never once in 9 years of wearing a badge encountered a consequence he couldn't outrun, outtalk, or simply absorb into the great forgiving machinery built around people who looked like him in uniforms like his. Walt had spent 31 years studying men exactly like this one across a dozen different countries and a dozen different uniforms. Men who mistook the absence of visible resistance for the absence of capability. Men who built entire identities on the comfortable assumption that nobody standing in front of them had ever truly been tested by anything that mattered. He had learned a long time ago, in places he would never name out loud in this mall or any mall, that the only thing more dangerous than that kind of certainty was correcting it too early. Before the moment had fully revealed itself, before the correction would actually land the way it needed to. So he waited. He had always, in every theater and every assignment across 3 decades, been good at waiting. Patience had saved his life more times than aggression ever had, and he saw no reason tonight in a shopping mall 20 minutes from his own kitchen to abandon the only discipline that had ever reliably kept him breathing. "I heard you," Walt said. "I'm not moving." Holloway's hand came back, open palm, wide theatrical arc. The kind of swing that wanted witnesses, that needed an audience to mean anything at all. His eyes stayed locked on Walt's the entire time, mean and bright, absolutely certain of what was about to happen, the way a man is certain of something he has done 100 times before to 100 people who never once fought back. The crack of it echoed off the atrium ceiling and rolled back down across the crowd like something physical. Walt's head turned with the impact, a sharp, clean sound that seemed to hang in the air a half-second longer than it should have. His eyes dropped toward the floor for just a moment, not from pain, not really, but the way a body registers an event before the mind has finished deciding what to do about it. For one full second, Nobody in that entire wing of the mall made a sound. The Christmas music kept playing overhead, absurdly cheerful, oblivious. Holloway liked that second. It was visible on his face, the stillness, the silence, the old man simply absorbing it without complaint or retaliation. He rolled his shoulder back with the loose, satisfied comfort of a man who had just had a private theory about the world publicly confirmed in front of an audience large enough to matter. The crowd's reaction arrived in fragments, the way shock always arrives. Not as a single unified gasp, but as a scattering of smaller individual responses colliding into each other in the same half-second. A woman near the food court pressed a hand flat against her own chest, as though checking that her heart was still doing what it was supposed to do. A teenage boy who had raised his phone moments earlier without quite committing to filming suddenly tightened his grip on it, his thumb finding the record button without him consciously deciding to press it, some older instinct taking over before his conscious mind caught up. Officer Rene Castillo's face moved through 3 visible stages in under 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked very much like horror. Her mouth slightly open, one hand half raised as though she had meant to step between them and had simply run out of time to do it. Simone Carter, the young woman in nursing scrubs, stood frozen with the receipt still extended in her hand. Her eyes locked on Walt's face with an expression that belonged to someone witnessing a kind of injustice so familiar it had momentarily stopped registering as surprising, only to be replaced an instant later by something closer to disbelief that someone had actually finally stepped between her and it. Otis, 10 feet back with the small wrapped gift box still clutched in one fist, had stopped breathing entirely. His face caught somewhere between fury and the particular fear of a man who had spent the last 90 seconds trying and failing to talk his best friend out of exactly this. An older man near the bench muttered something under his breath that nobody quite caught and didn't repeat it. He had every right to walk away the moment that first hand connected. Most people would have, and nobody watching could have blamed him for it. But he didn't move, and he didn't strike back either. Not yet. What would you have done in that exact second? Standing in his shoes, the whole mall watching, and nobody else stepping in? Would you have stayed silent and absorbed it? Or would you already have been moving before the second swing even started? Drop your answer below before you keep reading. And if this story is already pulling at something in you, go ahead and hit that like button. Now, it genuinely helps more people find stories like this one when it actually matters. Holloway's hand came back a second time. Same arc, same confidence, same absolute certainty of what was supposed to happen next, the certainty of a man who had never once needed a second attempt before and saw no reason to expect this would be the exception. It never landed. Later people who had been standing in that wing of the mall would struggle to describe exactly what they had seen happen in front of them. They would use words like fat and impossible, and I don't even know how to explain it. And none of those words would feel adequate even to the people saying them out loud to friends who hadn't been there. A woman near the pretzel stand would tell her husband that the first slap had happened too quickly to fully process. But the second one simply never had a chance to exist as anything other than an attempt that died somewhere in the air between Holloway's shoulder and Walt's face. What happened next took under 2 seconds. Several witnesses would later insist independently of one another that it had felt almost slower than that, as though time itself had briefly agreed to make room for what was coming. Walt didn't stumble from the first hit. He didn't reach for his face. He made no sound at all. The instant Holloway's hand came back for the second swing, Walt's left hand rose and closed around Holloway's extended wrist, mid-arc, clean, precise, the motion of a man plucking something out of the air, with no wasted effort and no visible exertion. The kind of economy of movement that only comes from having done a thing so many times that the body no longer consults the mind before acting. What followed happened in a sequence so practiced it looked almost gentle, the kind of motion that revealed nothing of the decades of repetition that had made it possible to perform under pressure without thought. A step forward inside the reach of Holloway's free arm, close enough that the difference in their size and weight ceased to matter entirely. The way it always ceases to matter once distance and leverage are properly understood. A rotation of the captured wrist outward and downward, applied with exact and measured pressure, enough to control completely. Never enough to break the precise calibration of a man who had been trained not merely to win a confrontation, but to end one cleanly, without leaving a mark that could later be photographed, measured, or used against him in exactly the kind of legal proceeding that men like Holloway tended to assume only applied to other people. A shift of weight, Holloway's own forward momentum redirected and quietly amplified rather than resisted. Head on, the oldest principle in the discipline, let the larger man's own force become the instrument of his own collapse. And then Officer Bryce Holloway, 6'1", 215 pounds, 9 years. A Caldwell police officer accustomed to being the largest and loudest presence in any room he chose to enter, was face down on the mall's polished tile floor, with his cheek pressed against the cold linoleum, and his own pulse hammering audibly in his ears, loud enough that for a moment it was the only sound he could process at all. His sidearm had come loose from its holster somewhere in the fall and skidded 6 feet across the polished floor, spinning once before coming to rest near the leg of a bench, where it would sit ignored for almost a full minute before anyone thought to retrieve it. Walt stepped back. He reached up with one hand and straightened the collar of his jacket, an almost absent-minded gesture, the motion of a man tidying himself after something entirely unremarkable, the way another man might adjust his tie after standing up from a chair. He looked down at Holloway, breathing hard, uninjured, pressed against the floor, with an expression that suggested his entire understanding of how this interaction was supposed to unfold had simply collapsed out from under him in the space of 2 seconds, and said quietly, without heat, without satisfaction, without anything in his voice that resembled triumph, "You should stay down." Then the mall exploded, not into violence, just into sound. Voices rose from every direction at once, overlapping, colliding into each other. Someone laughed a short, startled bark of disbelief that seemed to surprise the person making it. Someone else said, oh my God," 3 times in a row, without apparent awareness that she was repeating herself. A child somewhere began crying simply because the adults around him had stopped acting like adults are supposed to act in public, and children always know before they can explain how they know. Simone Carter stood completely still, the receipt still extended in her hand as though she had forgotten it was there at all, staring at Walt, the way people stare at something for which they don't yet have a category, something that doesn't fit cleanly into any shape their life has prepared them to expect. 15 feet away, 16-year-old Marcus Webb had gone rigid, his phone already raised and steady despite the trembling he could feel starting in his hands. He worked the kiosk near the food court 3 afternoons a week and had started filming the moment Holloway first grabbed Simone's arm, something about the scene pulling uncomfortably at the back of his neck, before he fully understood why he was reaching for his phone at all. He had not stopped recording since. He had all of it now, the grab the receipt held out, and ignored the word boy, the first slap landing clean and hard, the second one failing entirely, the 2 seconds of motion that followed Holloway face down on the floor. With his own gun several feet beyond his reach, Officer Renee Castillo reached Holloway first, helping him up by the arm with hands that were visibly shaking, despite her training. Despite 2 years of department conditioning, meant to keep exactly this kind of reaction under control in front of the public. She glanced once at Walt, not with fear, but with something closer to a question. She hadn't yet found words for something that looked almost like recognition before turning back to her partner. Holloway's face had gone a deep, furious red, the color climbing past his collar. He breathed through his nose in short, controlled pulls and did not look at Walt at all, as though looking at him directly might make the last 2 seconds more permanently real than they already were. Out of pure reflex, the muscle memory of a man who urgently needed to reassert control over something in the smoking wreckage of his own authority. Holloway turned towards Simone Carter. "You're under arrest." Castillo's hand closed over his arm before he could finish the sentence. "Bryce." "No." Her voice was low, urgent, final, in a way it had not been even a minute earlier before everything had changed. "She has a receipt. There are 40 people filming this right now. We are done here. We need to be done here." For a moment, it looked as though Holloway might argue, might push past her hand entirely and finish what he'd started. He glanced at the half-circle of onlookers, several with phones still raised and steady recording every additional second of whatever happened next, and something in the math of the moment seemed to register even through the haze of his own anger and humiliation. He released Simone's arm, though in truth he had never fully regained hold of it again after the fall, and said nothing further, his jaw working silently around words he apparently decided not to say out loud in front of 40 witnesses and at least a dozen cameras. Simone didn't run. She walked away with her back straight and her chin level, the receipt still folded carefully in her hand, and didn't look back once, not even when someone in the crowd called out something supportive after her. The crowd dispersed slowly, the way crowds always do after something has happened that they will spend the rest of the evening trying and failing to adequately describe to people who weren't there to see it themselves. A mall security guard finally arrived at a jog, almost 90 seconds too late to matter, speaking urgently into his radio, in a voice that suggested he had no idea what he was about to walk into or how to explain it to dispatch. Two older women near the jewelry kiosk stood close together, talking in low, rapid voices. One of them already pulling out her own phone to call someone she clearly needed to tell about this immediately. The teenage boy who had hesitated to film earlier now stood with his own phone raised, recording the aftermath, the cluster of officers, the old man in the quilted jacket walking calmly back toward his friend, as though absolutely nothing unusual had occurred in the last 3 minutes of his afternoon. A toddler, finally calmed by his mother after the crying, peered over her shoulder at the dispersing scene with wide, solemn eyes, too young to understand exactly what he had witnessed, but somehow old enough to know that the air in the room had changed in a way that mattered. Otis met Walt halfway, still clutching the small wrapped gift box against his chest, his expression caught somewhere between laughter and prayer, unable to settle fully into either one. "Walter," he said, and then seemed to run entirely out of whatever he had originally intended to say next. He simply handed back the box and put a hand briefly on Walt's shoulder. The gesture of a man checking with his own palm that his oldest friend was actually still standing in front of him, and not some version of the last 3 minutes that he had simply imagined out of sheer anxiety. They walked back toward the jewelry kiosk in silence. Priya was gripping the edge of the display case with both hands, her knuckles pale, watching the scene unfold from 20 feet away, with an expression of pure disbelief that hadn't yet resolved itself into words. When Walt approached, though there was nothing left to buy the bracelet already tucked safely in his coat pocket, she simply looked at him and asked, "Are you okay, sir?" "I'm fine," Walt said. "Thank you for asking." He and Otis left Riverside Commons Mall through the east entrance into the cold December afternoon, their breath visible in the air. The parking lot strung with municipal holiday lights that suddenly looked almost ridiculous against what had just happened 20 feet from a clearance rack. Otis didn't say a single word the entire walk to the car, which by his own later frequently repeated admission was the longest he had gone without speaking out loud in over 30 years. At 4:51 that afternoon, Marcus Webb uploaded the video from the driver's seat of his car in the mall parking lot, his hands still trembling slightly as he typed out a caption. He would later admit he barely remembered writing at all. By midnight, 4 million people had watched a gray-haired man in a quilted jacket absorb one open-handed slap without flinching, catch the second one mid-air, and put a Caldwell police officer face down on a mall floor in under 2 seconds. Someone online had already given the clip a title that spread faster than the footage itself, "Grandpa Don't Play." By the following morning, the view count would be 5 times that number and still climbing. Captain Russ Dalton watched the video for the first time at 7:40 the next morning, alone in his office with the blinds still drawn, a cup of coffee going cold on the corner of his desk, where he'd set it down 20 minutes earlier and forgotten about it entirely. He watched it 3 times in a row, his expression giving away nothing to the empty room around him. He did not lean forward the way most people leaned forward when they watched something shocking on a screen. He sat very still, hands folded on the desk in front of him, the particular stillness of a man already calculating what would need to be controlled and in precisely what order. Before the rest of the world finished waking up and forming opinions he wouldn't be able to manage. He picked up his phone. The first call was to the police union representative, a short conversation conducted in the clipped efficient shorthand of two men who had handled situations like this together before and didn't need to explain the stakes to each other. The second call was to the department's public information officer, instructing her on the exact careful language he wanted, used in any statement, language designed to sound measured and reasonable to anyone who hadn't seen the video, while giving just enough cover to anyone who had. The third call went to a number saved under 3 initials rather than a name. A contact reserved specifically for situations requiring quiet handling rather than public statements of any kind. Each call was brief. Each call was calm. Each one ended the same way, with the person on the other end understanding exactly what was being asked of them without Dalton ever having to spell it out in words that might later be repeated back to him. That was the particular advantage of a machine that had been running smoothly for 22 years without serious interruption. You didn't have to explain it to anyone anymore. You simply turned the key, and the entire apparatus moved on its own, every part already knowing its function. By 9 that morning, Officer Bryce Holloway sat across the desk from Captain Dalton with a legal pad and a department-issued pen, writing his incident report under Dalton's quiet, watchful, unmistakably guiding supervision. "Take your time," Dalton told him, his voice almost gentle. "Be thorough. Be precise. We only get to write this once." Holloway wrote for nearly 45 minutes, pausing twice to glance up at Dalton, as though checking his work against some standard only the captain could see. When he was finished, the report described an elderly civilian who had inserted himself into an active law enforcement encounter, ignored repeated lawful commands to disperse, and then executed what appeared to be a trained combat maneuver that caused the responding officer to fear seriously and immediately for his physical safety. There was no mention anywhere in the 4 typed pages of a slap. There was no mention of a receipt. There was no mention of a young woman in nursing scrubs who had done absolutely nothing wrong from the moment she walked into that clothing store to the moment she walked out of it. Dalton read the report once from beginning to end, nodded once to himself, and signed beneath Holloway's signature without a single word of comment. The clothing store's regional legal team called Captain Dalton's assistant before noon. The conversation lasted under 4 minutes. By the following morning, the store would release a statement explaining that no formal shoplifting accusation had ever been filed against Simone Carter, that the matter had simply been a misunderstanding involving store policy, and that the company valued all of its customers without exception. Officer Bryce Holloway's name did not appear anywhere in the 2 careful paragraphs. Neither did the word receipt. Neither did anything resembling an apology addressed directly to Simone. That same afternoon, the mall's general manager called 16-year-old Marcus Webb into a small back office that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. The manager, a soft-spoken man in a department store tie, who could not quite manage to look Marcus directly in the eye for the duration of the conversation, explained that using a personal device while on the clock was a clear violation of mall employment policy, and that the violation regrettably required immediate termination, effective that afternoon. "This is about the video," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question. This is a policy matter," the manager said, already shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "You've never enforced that policy before. Everybody on this floor is on their phone half the shift. I've watched you text your wife from the loading dock. You're free to collect your things from your locker," the manager said, already standing, already moving toward the door, as though the conversation itself had become something he badly wanted to physically distance himself from before it went any further. Marcus was the only income in his household 3 days a week, helping his mother cover rent while she worked a second job most evenings, stocking shelves at a grocery store across town. He had $412 saved toward community college money he'd been adding to one folded 20 at a time for almost a year, tracking the total in a small notebook he kept in his nightstand drawer. He walked out of Riverside Commons, still wearing his kiosk uniform, the embroidered name tag still pinned to his chest, and sat in his car in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before he found the steadiness to start the engine. He didn't delete the video. Nobody had explicitly asked him to yet, and by the time anyone thought to ask it, no longer mattered. It was already everywhere, multiplying faster than any single phone call or termination notice could ever hope to contain. Captain Russ Dalton had built his entire understanding of the world around a single durable principle. One he had never needed to examine too closely, because it had simply always worked without fail across 22 years of practice. The badge earned the benefit of the doubt automatically in every room that mattered, and the people who challenged that principle were almost without exception people whose own credibility could be quietly undermined if you knew which levers to pull and in what careful sequence. He had pulled those levers for 2 decades. He had buried complaints that should have ended careers smoothed over, incidents that should have triggered state-level investigations, and watched every single time, without exception, as the noise eventually faded and the department continued exactly as it had before, undisturbed, intact. He was not, in his own private accounting of himself, a corrupt man. He believed, with the particular sincerity of someone who has never once been forced to test the belief against real consequence, that he was simply protecting good officers from a public and a media apparatus that had already decided in advance and permanently that the police were always wrong, regardless of circumstance. The video bothered him, not because he doubted what it showed. He had watched it 3 times that morning alone and understood with total clarity exactly what it showed frame by frame, but because it represented the first piece of evidence in over 2 decades that he genuinely could not control the spread of through any of his usual channels. Everything else, every previous fire he had managed across his career, had burned for a news cycle or two, and then quietly gone dark once the local angle ran dry, and a new story replaced it in the public's limited attention. This one had already crossed 4 million views by the time he'd finished his second cup of coffee. He did not yet fully understand that the thing that should have actually frightened him wasn't the video itself at all. It was the eventual, inevitable question of who else had been quietly watching this man named Walter Briggs for the past 31 years, and what that watching might eventually come to mean for everyone currently standing inside Dalton's carefully maintained machine. By 1 that afternoon, Caldwell District Attorney Diane Forsyth stepped in front of a small cluster of local reporters outside the county courthouse, wearing a blue blazer and the practiced expression of a public official performing reluctant civic duty. For cameras, she had learned to angle herself toward without appearing to notice them. She announced that her office, after reviewing preliminary evidence, would be pursuing the maximum available felony charge against Walter Briggs for assault on a law enforcement officer. 4 years if convicted. She did not take questions afterward, turning instead toward a waiting car with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided in advance exactly how long this particular appearance needed to last, and not 1 second longer. The local paper's morning edition the next day carried a headline about an officer assaulted by an unidentified aggressor at a local shopping mall. A phrase that would have been almost funny under different circumstances, given how thoroughly identified Walt already was online. By that point, his face captured in dozens of screenshots circulating under headlines that had nothing careful or measured about them at all. Some sympathetic, some openly hostile, all of them moving faster than the official version of events could keep pace with. The police union spokesman, a thick-voiced man named Gary Pruitt, who had been doing this particular job for 11 years and had grown comfortable with its specific cadences, went on local radio that same evening and described the mall incident as an unprovoked, highly trained attack against a uniformed officer performing his lawful duties in good faith. He used the word trained 4 separate times over the course of an 8-minute segment, building toward it, each time like a chorus. He talked at length about officer safety, about the daily dangers of the job, about a culture that had stopped extending police officers the basic benefit of the doubt they deserved. He did not mention Simone Carter once, not by name, not by description, not even as an unnamed detail, somewhere in the broader narrative he was constructing for an audience that mostly hadn't seen the actual footage yet and was forming opinions entirely from his careful framing of it. Officer Renee Castillo heard the radio segment from her own car, parked outside a gas station 2 blocks from the precinct, and sat with both hands still gripping the wheel long after she'd finished filling the tank. The engine idling, the gas station's fluorescent lights buzzing faintly through her closed window. She had joined the department 2 years earlier with a genuine, almost embarrassingly earnest belief that she could be a different kind of officer, than some of the men she had trained alongside at the academy. More careful, more fair, someone who actually listened to a situation before reaching a conclusion about it. She had $11,000 left on her student loans and a mother in Phoenix who had cried with open pride at her academy graduation, sending a photo to every relative in 3 states, and Renee understood with a clarity that made her stomach physically ache exactly what would happen to both of those things. The debt, her mother's pride, if she said publicly what she had actually seen happen in that mall corridor. A senior officer named Dale Whitfield had already found her in the break room that morning, his tone friendly, almost paternal, suggesting in a low, easy voice that she might want to keep her own statement consistent with Bryce's report when the time eventually came, since memory under stress was notoriously unreliable, and nobody wanted her credibility questioned in front of a review board over small details that didn't really change the overall shape of the picture anyway. She had nodded at the time, mostly out of reflex. She had said nothing in response, which had felt in that exact moment like the safest possible kind of nothing she could offer. But sitting in her car now, replaying Pruitt's voice on the radio, describing a man who had stood completely still while being struck twice as a trained and dangerous attacker, she felt something settle low in her chest that was heavier and far steadier than fear, something closer to the specific quiet anger of watching a true and simple thing get methodically rewritten into a false and complicated one piece by deliberate piece, by people who had apparently come to expect her silence as a permanent and entirely reliable resource they could draw on indefinitely. That night, alone in her apartment with the blinds drawn and a single lamp on, Castillo opened a blank document on her laptop and began typing what she actually remembered in order with times and details she was certain of, and a clear separate note distinguishing them from details she wasn't fully confident about. She didn't yet know exactly what she would do with the document once it was finished. She only knew with a conviction that surprised her in its steadiness that she needed it to exist somewhere outside the official version Dalton's office had already begun quietly circulating as settled, agreed-upon fact among the people who mattered. She had every reason to stay quiet, a career still being built from scratch debt that didn't care about her conscience one way or another. A senior officer's friendly warning that landed exactly the way it was designed to land. Most people faced with that particular math choose the quiet option, and it's genuinely hard to blame them for it when you sit and think through everything they stand to lose. Do you think you'd have spoken up in her position, knowing what it might cost you personally, or would you have told yourself you were just being strategic too, the way she almost did? Let us know in the comments below, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss exactly how this unfolds from here. At 2:20 the following afternoon, 2 officers in a marked cruiser pulled up in front of a small brick house on Maple Hollow Lane, its front garden carefully maintained even in December, a few hardy chrysanthemums still holding stubborn color against the cold air. Walt answered the door in the same quilted jacket he had worn to the mall. He looked at the 2 officers standing on his porch and past them at the cruiser idling at the curb with its lights off but its engines still running. He didn't say anything immediately. He simply waited with the particular patience of a man who had been in considerably harder situations than this one across his life, and understood that sometimes the correct first move was to listen carefully to exactly what was coming before deciding how he intended to meet it. They told him he was under arrest for felony assault on a law enforcement officer. He asked if he could retrieve his coat from the hall closet. They said yes. He retrieved it, put it on over the jacket he was already wearing, locked his front door with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything else in his life, and walked to the cruiser without being guided there, lowering himself into the back seat on his own without assistance. The neighbors who watched from behind their curtains and from porches up and down Maple Hollow Lane would later describe in slightly different words, but with a striking consistency of detail that suggested they had all genuinely seen the same thing, the particular dignity of how Walt carried himself during the short walk from his front door to the waiting cruiser. Shoulders level, pace unhurried, no visible shame and no visible defiance. Either simply the steady bearing of a man absorbing something unjust without letting it alter how he moved through the world around him. Mrs. Patterson, 2 houses down, would later tell a local reporter that she had lived next to Walter Briggs for 9 years and had never once seen him raise his voice at anything, Including the afternoon, a delivery truck had backed directly into half his rose bed and crushed it flat. Mr. Okafor across the street came out onto his own porch in his socks, despite the cold, watching with his arms crossed and his jaw set tight, saying absolutely nothing. Because there was, in that specific moment, genuinely nothing he could think to say that would have changed anything happening 20 feet in front of him. A teenager on a bicycle slowed to watch the scene unfold, then sped up again almost immediately, visibly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing, but lacking any framework. Yet, for what a person his age was supposed to do about that discomfort. Somewhere down the block, a dog began barking at nothing in particular, as though even it could sense something had shifted in the ordinary rhythm of the street. Otis Green watched the cruiser pull slowly away from his own front window, 2 doors down, then went inside immediately to find his phone, his hands clumsy, with an urgency they almost never carried. He called Angela Briggs in Atlanta at 2:34. She picked up on the second ring. "They've got your father in handcuffs." "Angela," Otis said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar tightness underneath it, something close to fear dressed up in the steady, practiced calm of a man who had spent decades coaching teenagers through their own crises and instinctively reached for that same register. Now, even as his own voice shook faintly beneath it. Took him right out the front door just now. The whole street saw it happen. Angela Briggs was a civil rights attorney with 15 years of litigation experience, the kind of measured professional calm that came specifically from sitting across negotiating tables from people who wanted her to panic visibly and refusing every single time, without exception, to give them that particular satisfaction. That calm held for exactly 4 seconds after Otis finished speaking. Then it didn't hold at all. She made the 2-hour drive from Atlanta to Caldwell in just under 90 minutes, weaving through traffic with a focus that frightened her slightly, even as she maintained it. She would later remember almost none of the actual driving itself, only scattered fragments, the particular gray quality of the highway. In December afternoon light, Otis's voice on speakerphone repeating details she'd already fully absorbed the first time he'd said them, her own hands gripping the wheel considerably tighter than the actual driving conditions required. She posted bail using her firm's emergency client fund and waited afterward in the processing lobby of the Caldwell County Jail under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly and unevenly overhead, one of them flickering every few seconds in a way that made the whole room feel slightly unreal. Walt came through the release door at 8:50 that evening. His coat folded neatly over one arm, his collar still straight, despite everything that had happened to him that day. He looked at his daughter, the way he had always looked at her, across her entire life. Steady, quiet, taking her in like something he was deeply and permanently grateful for, even now, even here. Even under fluorescent lights in a county jail lobby. She crossed the lobby and hugged him hard enough that he made a small, involuntary sound of surprise before settling fully into it, holding on a moment longer than was strictly necessary for either of them. "You didn't have to drive tonight," he said quietly into her shoulder. "Daddy, I'm serious. It could have waited until morning, Angela." "It could not have waited," she said, pulling back just far enough to look at him directly. "And don't you dare try to argue with me about that particular point right now of all nights." He looked for a moment like he might try anyway. He didn't. A clerk read Angela the bail conditions in a flat, practiced monotone that didn't fully disguise her own visible discomfort, delivering them to a man who clearly didn't belong on the receiving end of a felony charge sheet. No contact with any mall employees, a 1-mile exclusion zone around Riverside Commons Mall. Immediate surrender of his passport effective that night. Angela filed a motion for an expedited preliminary hearing before they had even fully left the building, and was given a date 3 weeks out. 3 weeks. She didn't say out loud what she was already thinking about that timeline, about everything that could happen to a case in 3 weeks if the wrong people kept pulling the wrong levers. She simply thanked the clerk with careful, practiced, professional politeness and guided her father out to the car. They sat together at his kitchen table until almost midnight. Angela had her legal pad open in front of her, her pen uncapped, the charge sheet laid flat between them, which she had already read through 4 full times, and which seemed impossibly to get slightly worse with each careful reading. She asked Walt detailed, methodical questions about the mall, about the exact sequence of events, about precisely what he had said and when he had said it. He answered every question carefully and completely, without rushing through any of it, without editorializing or softening any detail, giving her exactly what was true and exactly what she needed, and nothing more than that. She had the entire incident fully documented in just under 40 minutes of careful work. She set her pen down on the legal pad. Then she asked him the other question, the one she had genuinely never asked him before, not properly, not with the full deliberate weight she put behind it now. She asked him to tell her everything, not just about the mall, about all of it, about what he had actually spent 31 years of his life doing before retiring quietly to this house, this garden, and these gentle Sunday phone calls with his granddaughter. Walt looked down at his own folded hands resting on the kitchen table for a long, unhurried moment before answering. Turning over in his mind, not for the first time in recent years, the particular weight of a decision he had made decades earlier and had never fully revisited since making it. He had told Dorothy almost everything eventually, in careful pieces spread across many years of marriage, because a partnership built entirely on omission tends to collapse under its own accumulated silence eventually, and theirs had been built on something considerably sturdier than that kind of foundation. But Angela had grown up believing her father worked in something vaguely described as State Department logistics, a phrase chosen specifically because it was vague enough to discourage any real follow-up questions and dull enough that an inquisitive teenager eventually simply stopped asking about it altogether, bored by the lack of any interesting detail to chase. He had built that careful vagueness, deliberately, brick by brick, across the entirety of her childhood. Not because he was ashamed of anything he had done in places he could never fully name out loud, but because he had wanted more than almost anything else in his life for his daughter's pride in him to come from somewhere simple and uncomplicated. Instead, a man who showed up reliably to her school plays, who taught her to drive in an empty grocery store parking lot on quiet Sunday mornings, who grew tomatoes in the backyard that never quite ripened correctly, but that he gave away to neighbors anyway, because throwing them out felt wasteful. He had wanted, in other words, to be wonderfully ordinary for her in the specific and deliberate way that men who have spent their entire working lives being anything but ordinary sometimes crave that ordinariness most desperately of all. Now, sitting across from her, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of a dinner. Neither of them had really eaten with a felony charge sheet sitting flat on the table between them. Like a verdict already rendered, he understood with total clarity that the convenient old vagueness had finally completely run out of road to hide behind. So he told her. He spoke quietly, without drama or theatrical weight, in the unhurried cadence of a man describing things that had happened long enough ago that their sharpest original edges had worn smooth, even though their underlying shape hadn't changed at all in the decades since. 31 years with the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service, postings scattered across the world that he still couldn't fully name out loud, even now, even to her. Operations that existed, if they existed in any official record at all anymore, only as a string of redacted lines and bare dates stripped entirely of context. 3 full decades spent recruiting, running, and protecting human sources in places where exposure meant something considerably worse than mere professional embarrassment for everyone involved. He talked for a long time, longer than either of them seemed to notice in the moment. Angela didn't interrupt him once across the entire telling. She didn't write a single word down on the legal pad in front of her, despite 15 years of professional habit telling her to document everything. She simply listened completely still. And the woman who had sat calmly through hostile depositions and tense courtrooms and difficult boardroom negotiations for a decade and a half now sat very quietly at her own father's kitchen table and listened to who her father had actually truly been for most of his adult life. When he finally finished, the kitchen stayed quiet for a long moment afterward. Angela looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Walt was quiet for a moment, looking past her toward the dark window and the garden beyond it, barely visible now, except as faint shapes layered against other shapes in the December dark. "Because I wanted you to be proud of me for the garden," he said finally, his voice low and entirely without performance. She looked at him for a long time after he said it, searching for something adequate to say in response and not quite finding the right shape for any of it. So instead, she simply reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with her own. He turned his palm upward beneath hers and held on the two of them sitting together in the quiet kitchen for several minutes, without either one speaking again. He went to bed roughly an hour later. She heard him moving down the hall in his room. A closet door opening on its slightly stiff hinge, a box being lifted carefully down from somewhere high on a shelf, the box set down onto something solid and flat. A latch opening with a small metallic click. A long, complete silence afterward. Then the latch closing again. Then nothing more at all. Angela sat alone at the kitchen table for a while. After that, the entire house gone fully quiet around her, except for the occasional settling creak of an old structure cooling in the night air. She opened her legal pad to a fresh page and wrote 3 words at the very top. In her own clean, precise handwriting, "Walter Briggs, my father." She underlined the line twice, pressing hard enough that the pen nearly tore the paper. Then she picked her pen back up, took a slow breath, and began building the only thing she truly knew how to build when almost everything else had been abruptly taken away from her in the space of a single terrible day, a case strong enough to bring him all the way home. Renee Castillo reached out to Angela 4 days later, not through any official channel, but through a message sent from a number Angela didn't recognize at first when it lit up her phone screen at 9:30 in the evening. "I have something you need to see. I can't come to your office. Name a place." Angela stared at the message for a long moment, sitting at the same kitchen table where she and her father had talked until midnight only days earlier. In 15 years of practice, anonymous contacts had gone exactly 2 ways. They were either precisely what they claimed to be, offering something genuinely useful at real personal risk to the sender. Or they were the other thing, entirely a setup designed to pull her sideways and waste precious time at exactly the moment she most needed to be moving straight ahead toward the hearing. She typed back Caldwell Memorial Park, the bench by the East Pond, 7 tonight. No confirmation came back, just silence, the particular kind of silence that arrives when someone has already made their decision internally and doesn't feel any further need to discuss it out loud. Angela arrived at this park 10 minutes early. Her car the only one in the small gravel lot. The December air was sharp and clean, cold enough to feel distinctly in her teeth when she breathed too deeply through her mouth instead of her nose. The pond sat gray and perfectly still, edged with thin frost along the banks, a few ducks moving sluggishly near the far shore as though they too were conserving warmth against the falling temperature. Bare branches overhead clicked faintly against each other in a wind too light to really be called wind at all. The bench faced the water with its back to the walking path, a small architectural detail that meant she could hear footsteps approaching from behind her without ever appearing to be watching for them. A habit she realized with a small private jolt somewhere in her chest that she had picked up from her father years earlier without ever once understanding why she did it instinctively. She hadn't known until 3 nights ago, sitting at that kitchen table, exactly why she always chose to sit this particular way in public spaces, why she always noted the exits in restaurants, why she'd never once in her adult life sat with her back fully to a door. Now she understood completely, and the understanding settled strangely in her chest, somewhere uneasy, between old grief for a version of her father she'd never gotten to know, and an odd, complicated new pride in the one she was only now meeting. The footsteps came at exactly 7 precise to the minute. The woman who sat down beside her was dressed plainly in civilian clothes, jeans, a dark canvas jacket, a knit cap pulled low against the cold that partially shadowed her face. She moved with the contained, deliberate posture of someone who had spent a long time being watched professionally, and had learned out of pure necessity to take up exactly as much physical space as she needed, and not 1 inch more than that. She didn't introduce herself right away. She looked out at the pond for a moment, first her breath visible in the cold air. "My name is Renee Castillo," she said finally. "I'm an officer with the Caldwell Police Department." A pause longer than the sentence required. "For now." Angela looked at her without saying anything, waiting. Castillo reached into her jacket and produced a thin manila folder, holding it out across the small gap between them on the bench. Angela took it. Inside were pages clean, organized, carefully dated. Summaries, case numbers, incident logs, names, addresses, brief factual descriptions of what had happened and exactly when it had happened. Angela read the first page, then the second. She slowed considerably on the third, then the fourth. 12 complaints, Castillo said quietly, watching the water rather than Angela. 4 years. Excessive force allegations in most of them. Discriminatory targeting documented in at least 7. In 2 of those cases, physical contact severe enough that the complainant required actual medical attention afterward. She said it the way a person says something they have already repeated silently inside their own head so many times across so many sleepless nights that it has lost some of its original shock value, though none whatsoever of its underlying weight. Every single complaint was logged properly. Everyone was assigned a formal case number. Every single one of them was closed without any disciplinary action taken against him. Angela looked up sharply from the folder. Closed by who, specifically? 9 of them were closed under Captain Dalton's direct personal authority. The other 3 went through a lieutenant, who understood without ever once being told directly, in so many words, exactly which way the wind blew inside that building, and acted accordingly. Angela looked back down at the folder, turning another page, finding another name, another date, another quietly buried case number sitting beneath a closure stamp that should never have been applied. How long have you been holding on to this material? About 8 months formally. I started pulling old records quietly after I noticed a pattern building in Bryce's stops, who he pulled over, who he questioned how those interactions tended to escalate compared to others. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with any of it once I had it. I told myself for a long time that I was simply being careful. Strategic. Castillo finally looked away from the pond and out toward nothing in particular. The ducks had drifted closer to the near bank without either woman fully noticing the movement. They put a 67-year-old man in handcuffs and walked him out of his own front door in front of his entire street in broad daylight. I watched the clip on the local news in my own living room that evening alone, and I remember thinking. She stopped abruptly, started again, her voice tighter this time. Her jaw set. I'm done being strategic about this. Angela closed the folder, carefully holding it against her knee. If I use this in his defense, she said, your name comes out publicly. Eventually, but certainly. You understand that completely. I do. Dalton will come after you professionally and probably personally too. I've spent 15 years watching men exactly like him operate, and I know precisely what that looks like once it starts. Castillo looked at her directly for the first time since sitting down on the bench. I've watched him operate up close for 2 full years now. I'm honestly not afraid of him anymore. I think I burned through whatever fear I had for him about a week ago. She said it plainly, without bravado, simply as an established fact she had already settled fully within herself before ever sending that first text message. Angela held the folder against her chest, considering. I'll need a sworn affidavit from you. Secure channel properly witnessed. I can have the entire setup ready for you by tomorrow morning. Castillo nodded once decisively, stood buttoned her jacket fully against the cold, and walked back up the gravel path without once looking back over her shoulder. Angela sat alone on the bench for a long while afterward as the temperature continued dropping, the frost thickening visibly at the pond's edge. She opened the folder again in the gathering dark, angling the pages toward the distant glow of a street lamp, and read every one of the 12 names slowly, one at a time, letting each one sit with her for a moment before moving to the next. The following morning, Angela filed an expedited request through the appropriate federal channel, acting as Walt's formal attorney of record, requesting only a limited declassification of his service summary, the bare operational minimum necessary to establish character and historical context ahead of the upcoming hearing, deliberately not requesting his complete and unredacted record. The acknowledgement came back within a few hours, automated and entirely impersonal. In its phrasing, informing her that 2 separate security clearance verifications would be required before any processing could begin, with an estimated return window of 48 hours. The summary arrived electronically, just under 50 hours later, landing in her inbox at 9 in the morning, with a subject line as bureaucratically flat as the acknowledgement had been. Angela opened it at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and her reading glasses on, bringing to it the same quiet, methodical focus she brought to every document in her career that had genuinely mattered. She had expected perhaps 3 or 4 pages, a brief character summary at most. The file ran to 11 pages instead, and more than half of it had been redacted entirely, not blacked out the casual way. Civilian records sometimes were, with a stray name or address, blocked here and there, but whole paragraphs reduced down to a single surviving line, a bare date here, an isolated location code there, entire operational periods that simply began and then stopped without any surrounding explanation at all. Not because the underlying work had genuinely ended at that point, but because whatever had happened during it remained even decades later, something the federal government had formally and deliberately decided the public still did not need to know. What survived the heavy redaction was nonetheless enough to settle with real physical weight in her chest as she read. 31 years of continuous clandestine service. 3 confirmed overseas postings spanning 2 separate continents across 2 different decades. Commendations that referenced specific heroic actions, which the commendations themselves frustratingly declined to actually describe in any detail. A formal notation dated several years prior regarding a classified intelligence honor that had only recently been partially declassified for limited narrow acknowledgement in exactly this kind of legal context. She sat with those 11 pages for a long time after finishing them, the coffee going cold beside her elbow, trying earnestly to reconcile this careful, fragmented, redacted shape of a stranger's extraordinary professional record with the quiet, unhurried man she had personally watched water tomato plants every single summer of her own childhood, weekend after weekend, and finding to her own quiet surprise that the 2 versions of her father didn't actually contradict one another at all. Once she sat with it long enough, they simply finally explained each other completely for the very first time in her 38 years of life. 12 buried complaints, a documented pattern that had been quietly closed out and filed away for 4 straight years by the very people whose actual job was supposedly to take exactly this kind of pattern seriously. If you've ever personally watched something get covered up right in front of you and felt genuinely powerless to stop it from happening, you already understand a piece of exactly what Renee Castillo carried alone for 8 long months before she finally worked up the nerve to walk into that park and hand over the folder. Do you think most people in her exact position would have eventually found that same courage, or do you think most people would have quietly stayed silent and told themselves it wasn't their fight? Tell us honestly in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss exactly how this hearing plays out next. The preliminary hearing convened 9 days later in a county courtroom with tall windows and pale winter light slanting in long bars across the worn wooden benches. Walter Briggs sat beside Angela at the defense table, his posture upright but not stiff, his weathered hands folded calmly in front of him on the table's surface. Across the narrow aisle sat Bryce Holloway, dressed in his full department uniform, jaw set hard, his eyes fixed somewhere just past the judge's empty bench rather than anywhere near the defense table. Captain Dalton sat directly behind him in the gallery's front row, arms crossed over his chest, his expression carefully arranged into something meant to resemble calm, professional confidence. Though his knuckles, if anyone had looked closely enough, were slightly pale where his fingers gripped his own forearms. Angela rose first when the proceedings opened formally, entering the manila folder's full contents into the official record, 12 documented complaints, 9 separate closures occurring under Captain Dalton's direct personal authority, sworn supporting statements from 2 of the original complainants who had agreed only after Castillo's affidavit became part of the public record to finally come forward and speak about their own experiences themselves on the record under oath. She entered Castillo's sworn statement next, read aloud in full, before the court describing precisely what she had personally witnessed and heard in that mall corridor, word for word with nothing softened for comfort and nothing convenient omitted. Then Angela formally introduced the declassified service summary. The judge, an older woman named Patricia Voss, who had presided over Caldwell's courtroom for 19 years and had built in that considerable span of time a well-earned reputation for not being easily moved by theatrics of any kind. From either side of her courtroom, looked up slowly from the pages in front of her and addressed Walt directly. Her tone neutral and measured. Mr. Briggs, for the record, can you personally confirm the accuracy of the summary submitted today by your counsel? Walt rose slowly and deliberately to his feet beside the defense table. The courtroom had gone very quiet around him, the particular kind of hush that settles heavily over a room when everyone present senses, without anyone needing to say so aloud, that something genuinely significant is about to happen in front of them. "Yes, Your Honor," Walt said, his voice level and entirely unhurried, carrying easily through the high-ceilinged room without him needing to raise it even slightly above a conversational volume. 31 years with the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service. 3 confirmed overseas postings. I am not permitted to discuss the specific operational details, as the majority of that record remains formally classified for reasons that extend well beyond my own personal discretion to decide. But I can confirm under oath that the summary submitted to this court today is accurate as written. He paused for a moment, his gaze moving deliberately and entirely without rush directly across the narrow aisle to where Bryce Holloway sat rigid in his pressed uniform. For the first time since that afternoon in the mall, the 2 men looked at each other fully directly, with absolutely nothing standing between them. Anymore, no badge to hide behind, no gathered crowd to perform for, no receipt to dismiss, no slap already midair. Simply 2 men standing in a quiet winter courtroom, finally seeing one another with total clarity. Holloway's face moved through a visible, almost clinical sequence over the span of just a few seconds. Confusion, first registering plainly across his features, then a dawning, genuinely sickening recognition settling in behind it, the color draining steadily out of his complexion in real time until his skin had gone the pale, flat gray of old wet concrete. His hands resting on the defense table in front of him began to tremble faintly and visibly, and he pressed them flat against the wood surface as though sheer physical pressure might somehow stop the shaking from continuing. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, or perhaps simply to breathe more deliberately. Nothing came out of it at all. Full seconds passed in that courtroom, without a single competing sound anywhere in the room, no chair creaking against the old wooden floor, no paper shuffling in anyone's hands, no audible breath anywhere in the packed gallery behind them. 5 long seconds that stretched out far enough for every single person present to feel their precise, almost physical weight pressing down on the room. Walt held Holloway's gaze steadily for the entire 5 seconds, without satisfaction visible anywhere in his expression, without anger, without anything whatsoever that resembled triumph or vindication. It was simply the calm, settled expression of a man who had finally been handed, after everything that had happened to him over the preceding weeks, exactly what he had needed from this process, and not one thing more than that. In the gallery behind them, several people pressed hands flat against their own mouths in visible shock. A local reporter seated in the second row lowered her phone entirely, the recording apparently forgotten for a moment in the face of what she was actually witnessing unfold live in front of her. Otis, seated farther back near the rear doors, gripped the wooden bench in front of him with both hands and said absolutely nothing at all, which for a man as constitutionally talkative as Otis Green was its own form of powerful testimony. Captain Dalton's crossed arms slowly came uncrossed at his sides. He did not turn to look at Holloway beside him. He stared straight ahead at the empty space above the judge's bench, his expression carefully unreadable to anyone watching already. Even in that frozen and silent moment, beginning the familiar internal work of calculating exactly what needed to happen next to contain this, and in what order it would need to happen, Judge Voss allowed the silence to hold a moment longer before she finally spoke again. Her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the entirely still room. "The court will take a brief recess," she said. "We'll resume in 20 minutes. She rose from the bench and disappeared through a side door near the front of the courtroom. The room itself remained almost entirely motionless for several seconds, even after she had gone, as though nobody present quite trusted themselves to be the first one to move. When the hearing resumed 20 minutes later, the room felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside or the radiator clanking faintly in the corner. Judge Voss reviewed the evidence one final time, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead while she spoke aloud for the record, then set the entire file down flat in front of her on the bench. "The court finds insufficient basis to proceed on the charge of felony assault," she said, her voice carrying clearly and without hurry through the still room. The evidence presented today, including the video footage, the sworn statement of Officer Castillo, and the documented pattern of conduct associated with Officer Holloway, establishes that Mr. Briggs acted in lawful self-defense and in defense of a third party. All charges against Walter Briggs are dismissed, effective immediately, with prejudice. Walt didn't smile. He didn't lean back in his chair or exhale loudly, the way some defendants did when a verdict finally broke their way after weeks of uncertain waiting. He simply nodded once, a small, contained motion, and reached over to set his hand briefly on Angela's, where it rested on the table between them, his fingers steady, despite everything. Angela, who had spent the better part of 2 decades training herself out of visible emotion in courtrooms, exactly like this one training, that had served her well through dozens of difficult cases that weren't her own father's life, found that her eyes had gone wet anyway. And this time, she didn't bother fighting it at all. Behind them in the gallery, Otis made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Loud enough that the bailiff glanced over it once before deciding evidently that it didn't require any actual intervention on his part. Walt's relief when it finally showed at all, showed quietly, a slight, almost imperceptible loosening across his shoulders that had been carrying real tension for 3 solid weeks without him ever once admitting it out loud to anyone, including himself, including Angela, including the empty garden he talked to most evenings. Renee Castillo, seated several rows back, pressed a hand briefly to her own chest and closed her eyes for just a moment, as though setting down something heavy she had been carrying for 8 long months, finally completely for good. District Attorney Diane Forsyth issued a public statement that same afternoon, considerably more carefully worded than her press conference 3 weeks earlier, had been acknowledging that her office's initial review had not fully accounted for material evidence that later came to light during the investigation, and that Mr. Briggs's actions on the date in question were consistent with lawful self-defense under the full circumstances now established. She did not apologize directly, choosing her language with the practiced caution of someone who understood the difference between acknowledgement and liability. It was nonetheless as close to an apology as Caldwell's office had issued in recent memory, and local commentators noted the distinction at length in the days that followed. The consequences that followed arrived in sequence over the following weeks, and none of them arrived quietly or all at once. Bryce Holloway was terminated from the Caldwell Police Department within 5 days of the hearing, the termination processed without the usual internal review delay that typically stretched such matters out for months. State prosecutors filed charges against him for falsifying an official police report, a felony in its own right, and a separate federal civil rights review was formally opened into the broader pattern documented across his 12 buried complaints, with investigators reaching out individually to several of the original complainants for the first time in years. He did not appear before cameras at any point during the unfolding fallout. He issued no public statement of any kind through his attorney or otherwise. There was, by that point in the story, nothing left for him to perform for, and seemingly no audience left interested in watching him try. Captain Russ Dalton submitted his resignation 8 days after the hearing in writing, without public comment of any kind, before the formal request for his termination could be finalized and made official by city administration. The city council accepted the resignation in an emergency session that filled every available seat in the small municipal chamber for the first time in recent memory. Residents standing along the back wall when the seats ran out. A separate state inquiry was opened into his handling of the 12 buried complaints spanning his tenure as captain. With subpoenas issued for internal records, he had assumed across more than 2 decades of quiet practice would never see daylight outside the walls of his own office. Renee Castillo was reinstated with full back pay, and a formal commendation entered permanently into her personnel file, the first commendation of her 2-year career. 3 months later, she was promoted into a newly created internal accountability role within the department, specifically tasked with reviewing exactly the kind of complaint pattern she had once quietly documented alone off the clock, typing into a blank document on her own laptop with the blinds drawn. On her first morning in the new position, she requested the old complaint files from records, including the 12 that had once filled Dalton's locked desk drawer for years without consequence. She read through every one of them again, carefully, slowly, then filed each one properly into the permanent record where it should have lived all along, closing the drawer afterward in front of her new team without a word because none of them needed one. Marcus Webb was rehired by mall management within 2 weeks, accompanied by a formal written apology delivered personally by the regional manager and full back pay covering the entire period of his termination, calculated down to the hour. The mall's corporate office, facing mounting public pressure once the full story became widely known beyond the original viral clip, separately funded his first full year of community college tuition. The commitment formalized in writing and made public in a statement that finally, 3 weeks late, mentioned his name directly and by name. He declined the company's offer of reinstatement to his old kiosk position behind the pretzel counter. He enrolled in introductory business classes that following January. Instead, the $412 in his personal savings account finally joined by considerably more. His small notebook of folded 20s retired to a drawer. Its job finally finished. Simone Carter filed a civil claim against the Caldwell Police Department, which settled before ever reaching a courtroom once the full weight of the assembled evidence became unmistakably clear to the city's own legal counsel. She declined the largest portion of the proposed settlement amount, directing it instead toward funding a small legal aid clinic focused specifically on wrongful detention cases throughout the county. A decision she explained simply in one brief statement to a local reporter who tracked her down outside the hospital where she still worked double shifts most weeks as wanting something genuinely good to eventually come out of the worst single afternoon of her adult life. Look at how far the consequences actually reached once the truth finally got room to breathe in that courtroom. Not just one officer held accountable for one bad afternoon, but an entire structure that had been quietly protecting him for years finally forced out into the light where it couldn't hide anymore. That almost never happens this completely in real situations like this one, which is part of exactly why stories like Walt's resonate the way they do with people. Which part of the fallout do you think mattered the most? In the end, the charges against Holloway, the inquiry into Dalton or Renee Castillo, finally getting to do the job she'd always genuinely wanted to do properly. Let us know honestly below and hit subscribe so you're here with us for the next story when it drops. 3 weeks after the hearing concluded on a cold Saturday evening, with frost already forming visibly on the windows by mid-afternoon, a small gathering filled the modest living room and adjoining kitchen of Walt's house on Maple Hollow Lane. Someone had strung simple white lights along the mantel above the unused fireplace. Someone else had brought sweet potato pie, still faintly warm from the oven, the smell of it moving steadily through every room of the small house in a way that felt deliberate and entirely welcome. It wasn't a large gathering. It was never meant to be one. Otis had arranged most of it personally, making a handful of phone calls until the evening simply assembled itself, the way things tend to when the person organizing them has spent decades getting complicated things done with limited resources and absolutely no margin for error to work with. Angela was there naturally, seated on the arm of the couch rather than properly settled in a chair, too restless with quiet happiness to fully sit still through an entire evening. Renee Castillo arrived a little after 6, visibly unsure at first whether she truly belonged at a private family gathering like this one, until Angela crossed the small room directly and told her plainly, without hesitation, that she did, that there genuinely wasn't a version of this particular evening that made full sense without her standing in it. Maya, freshly turned 12, only days earlier, sat curled comfortably on the floor near her grandfather's chair, the small silver star bracelet from the mall already fastened securely around her wrist, exactly where she had kept it every single day since the morning she'd first unwrapped the box. Walt sat in his usual armchair near the front window, the December garden visible just beyond the cold glass in the gathering early dark, Dorothy's roses cut back properly for winter, but still standing upright in their careful tended rows along the back fence line. He wore a plain dark sweater rather than his familiar quilted jacket, and for the first time in 3 difficult weeks, His shoulders carried no visible weight at all, the change subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had watched him closely throughout the ordeal. Someone had brought out an old framed photograph of Dorothy from the hallway and set it carefully on the side table near the window. Not as a formal memorial exactly, just as a quiet, natural acknowledgement that she still belonged in this particular room too. Even now, even like this, surrounded by people who loved the man she'd loved. The conversation moved easily and warmly around him throughout the evening, voices overlapping comfortably, the way they do at gatherings, where everyone present has genuinely earned the right to simply relax together without performance. Otis holding court near the kitchen doorway, with some long story about the football team he'd coached 3 decades earlier. Angela laughing freely at something Castillo had just said quietly beside her. The warm smell of the pie filling every corner of the small house from the kitchen outward. At one point in the evening, Maya climbed up onto the wide arm of Ram, grandfather's chair, and leaned her full weight comfortably against his side, the way she had done since she was small enough to fit easily in his lap during Sunday afternoons. He put one steady hand over hers where it rested against his forearm. "Grandpa," she said quietly, just between the two of them, her voice pitched low enough that the rest of the room's conversation continued undisturbed around them. "Were you really a spy?" Walt considered the question for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and unhurried rather than evasive or dismissive. "I worked for the government in a part of it that didn't get talked about very much. For a very long time," he said finally. "And I always tried very hard every single day of it, no matter where I was or what I was doing, to do right by the people I was responsible for protecting. That's most of what actually mattered in the end. The rest of it is mostly just details that don't change the important part." "That's not really a full answer. It's the truest one I've got for you tonight," he said. And something quiet in his eyes when he said it made her decide, for the moment at least, that it was genuinely enough to satisfy her, for now. Later, after most of the small gathering had said their warm goodbyes, and the house had settled fully into its familiar evening quiet, Walt stood alone for a few minutes at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark garden where Dorothy's roses still stood tended and patient, waiting out the winter the way they did faithfully every single year before returning each spring exactly where they were always supposed to be. He thought, as he often did in quiet moments, exactly like this one, about something Dorothy used to say to him on difficult days. Early in their long marriage, long before any of this, long before the mall, long before 31 years of work, he could still barely speak of even now to the people he loved most in the world. "You don't have to be the loudest person in any room to be the steadiest one in it," she used to tell him, usually while doing dishes or folding laundry. Never with any particular ceremony. Just be the one who's still standing when it actually matters most. He had tried across an entire long life spent in rooms and countries far more dangerous than a shopping mall in December, to live by exactly that one simple instruction she'd given him so casually decades ago. He supposed standing now at his own kitchen window, with his granddaughter's laughter still echoing faintly from the next room, and his daughter's voice carrying warmly through the small house behind him, that he had finally managed, after absolutely everything that had happened, to get at least that much right. If this story moved something in you tonight, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who could use a reminder that quiet, steady courage still genuinely wins in the end. And make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss the next story we have waiting for you. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with us today. Stories like Walt's matter to us not because they're easy to sit with, but because they remind us that dignity can't be slapped out of a person, no matter how many times someone tries, and that the truth, even buried carefully for years, has a way of eventually finding daylight when the right people refuse to stay quiet. We're genuinely grateful for every single one of you who stays with us until the very end. We'll see you in the next one.